Thank you, Chair. Thank you also all of the colleagues that we have worked together on this regulation. I'd like to remind myself that the draft regulation starts with these two words, building trust. And so I think that this should be our first goal, and I've also been very happy to find that clear considerations on data protection, data minimization, and the security of electronic transactions have been shared between me and the other shadow rapporteurs from the different political groups. I believe that those considerations are essential to bring trust, and so they need to be also at the focus of our work. I would like to thank the rapporteur, Mrs. Ulvskog, for starting the discussions in a collaborative manner during our shadow meeting of last week. And in particular, I think it's relevant that she is seriously considering the issue of authentication. It seems to me that identification is not actually the technical process that is not harmonized between the member states. Rather, it's validation services which authenticate users that are actually not harmonized. The means by which we tell somebody that we conform to the requirements of their services. This is a technical system if you can't meet the person face to face, and so this is the place where the member states have chosen different solutions. And so if we talk about interoperability, then clearly it is the interoperability of the technical system, I would assume, rather than the legal system, because the authentication means are completely technical. And so I would like to ask the Commission's opinion, actually, on this, maybe a bit change of perspective from identification, which is a very ambiguous and philosophical term, like what's my identity, what's somebody's identity, onto maybe a more topical discussion of how do we create the interoperability that actually, I guess, all of the member states and also the citizens in the member states want. In doing so, it is also important, and I think my colleagues agree with me, that we don't allow a technical harmonization process to be a spiral downwards to the lowest standards of security and lowest standards of privacy that exist in the Union. Some of the member states additionally have a strong focus on keeping different institutions apart, like in Germany and in Austria, whereas other member states put them all in the same basket, like Belgium or even like Sweden. And so how would we make sure that interoperability between technical services for the validation of somebody conforming to the requirements of a particular government service doesn't undo those institutional frameworks that I guess in many member states are important to safeguard. Then it's been striking me a different thing, which is that we are talking about both the trust services and the electronic identification services and authentication means as if they are services. And that gives me the insight that maybe I, the citizen, should be allowed to choose. And I'm wondering then why we are not creating a technical harmonization to the level where I, the citizen, could choose to have the authentication means on the internet for e-government services that I trust, that I feel is secure, and that I am confident respects my privacy. And so I would like to hear the Commission's reflections on that point. A final consideration which we didn't raise yet in the shadow meetings, but that we will raise, is how do we ensure in the best possible manner security in these applications. And so my preferred route for the committee and for the regulation would be security by transparency, which means that you can have proper audits, as was raised by my liberal colleague, and that they are open also for the scrutiny of other people. Whereas the Electronic Signatures Directive from 1999, on the contrary, had a very strong emphasis on security by policy, which turned out to not necessarily pilot the economy, actually, as it was meant to do. And so I would like to hear the Commission's reflections on security by transparency and how they would look at the possibility of introducing more of that into this regulation so that we can ensure that the trust, the security is transparent, auditable, and understandable for the people who ultimately will depend on all of these services to interface with their entire government structure. And so I'm looking forward to hearing the Commission's comments on that, and I would like to thank you for your time and all of my colleagues for their cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. First, I would like to congratulate the rapporteur and all the honourable members of the committee for the contributions to the reflection and to the discussion on the proposal that was tabled by the Commission. I think that the focus that was put forward by the rapporteur on what is indeed that we are going to achieve and what is the long-term objectives of the proposal is indeed what is driving the Commission, what I think should be driving us in the consideration of possible improvement to the proposals. As a general comments before going to the question that were raised by members of the committee, as a general comments on the amendments, indeed, I mean, the Commission is very much, I would say, sharing the intention, or most of the intentions and the objectives somehow captured in the proposed amendments. Of course, I mean, we have to make sure that the overall result of this process will, in a way, keep the focus on the objectives of boosting trust and making the possibility for relying party and service providers to indeed operate in the same spirit of ensuring the highest level of security and trustworthiness in the transactions that are supported by the services covered by the regulation. In this respect, of course, proportionality, in particular in relation to what is indeed proposed as a possible, I would say, regime for trust service providers, so not the qualified, is indeed one element that has to be kept in mind, and in this respect the Commission indeed will indeed work with all of you in order to ensure that this principle will be respected to the benefit of all parties, service provider and citizen. Now to the question. There were three questions by MEP Andersdotter. The first one was indeed on validation versus authentications. I would like to remind that the regulation is not, has not the ambition of harmonizing the provisioning of identity and the provisioning of the validation process which are associated to the provisioning of identity in the electronic world, but is indeed focusing on providing a minimal regime, legal regimes that will make it possible to recognize the electronic authentication means which are provided in member states and that in member states are already recognized by the member states as suitable for their citizens to access public services within those countries. Once this is happened, of course, the member states may decide whether or not to notify one or more schemes which are in operation in the member states and recognize at the member states level in order to make their citizens to be able to access public services outside the territory where the means are provided. In particular, and this is indeed the focus of the regulation, those services that requires by law or by administrative practices the use of electronic identification means. So that is, to some extent, I would say, the scope, and this is why the legal framework that is provided, as indeed to build on technical interoperability platforms, which was alluded to by one of you in his intervention, by MEP Creutzmann, in relation to what are the piloting activities that the Commission has funded since 2008, in particular the Project Stork and the successors of Stork, which are ongoing at the moment. So in this respect, indeed, we are not going for harmonization, and we consider the recognition of electronic identification means, in particular in relation to the authentication process that are supporting, as the very focus of what the technical interoperability should be focusing on. So in this respect, everything that goes in that direction, of course, will be welcome by the Commission. Of course, I also have to say that the word invalidation may embrace elements of provisioning identity or registration of identity, which falls under the responsibility of member states, and on which there is no legal basis to I would say, harmonise or to dictate any provision. And as I think it was alluded to in the intervention of members of the committee, we should leave the member states the full responsibility for their activity. The second question was on the choice of citizens. Of course, in connection to the use of electronic identification means to access services in the network, of course, freedom of choice should be, I would say, a principle, and indeed even the regulation is not, I would say, denying this possibility. However, we should also not overlook the fact that the recognition of electronic identification means is, and what type of means and what type of security levels is indeed to be associated to the electronic identification means being recognised, is a full responsibility of the relying party, which means that in the case of what is indeed the ambition of the regulation, the relying party for which the recognition is somehow introduced as an obligation are public administration or providers of public services, which at the national level have decided which type of electronic identification means, or at least which type of security associated to electronic identification means may indeed be acceptable. So the regulation is not going, I would say, against the principle of multiplicity of electronic identification means or of choice. However, we should not overlook the responsibility of, in the case of public sector, of member states to decide what the policy is about. And even more importantly, we should also, I would say, recognise that it is a responsibility of member states to indeed establish appropriate accreditation schemes that might be indeed suitable to make citizens to be able to use other means that are not necessarily the one provided by member states. But this is a decision of member states. It's not something that we can impose with the regulation. And the last point is on security by transparency. Of course, that is an extremely important principle, and the Commission is fully sharing these objectives. This is why, in particular, for qualified trust service provider, we have introduced the obligation for providers to produce before the initiation of their operation and on a regular basis during their operations security audit or conformity assessment report, which indeed should illustrate the way in which the trust service providers, qualified trust service provider, have met their obligation to ensure security, trustworthiness, continuity of their operation. Thank you.